The biggest mistake you can make is assuming you already know who you're looking at. At exactly 3:02 in the morning, the quiet suburban street sat under a blanket of darkness. Porch lights glowed faintly through the cool spring air. Sprinklers clicked somewhere in the distance. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt urgent. Then everything changed. A convoy of police vehicles rolled silently into the neighborhood, their headlights sweeping across manicured lawns and parked cars. Doors opened. Officers stepped out. Radios crackled softly. Within seconds, the peaceful silence outside a two-story brick home disappeared beneath the weight of official urgency. Inside that home, Ava Brooks was asleep. Her reading glasses rested on a hardcover law book beside her bed. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the nightstand, forgotten hours earlier after another long evening of paperwork. She had fallen asleep reviewing documents, something she had done more times than she could count. The digital clock beside her bed glowed 3:02 a.m. when the sharp sound of knocking shattered the silence. Ava's eyes opened immediately. Before she could fully process what was happening, another loud knock echoed through the house. Then another. The sound wasn't casual. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't an emergency delivery. It carried authority, urgency, the kind of sound that instantly made people fear the worst. Ava sat upright. Her heart accelerated, but her face remained calm. Years in the legal system had taught her that panic rarely improved a situation. She slipped on a robe and stepped into the hallway. The knocking continued, faster now, louder. Downstairs, blue and red lights flashed through the living room windows, painting the walls with shifting colors. The sight immediately told her this was no misunderstanding involving a neighbor. Somehow, the police were here for her house. She descended the staircase carefully. The hardwood steps creaked beneath her feet. Through the front window, she could see multiple officers standing outside. Some wore tactical vests. Others stood near vehicles positioned along the curb. Several neighbors had already turned on their lights. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened slightly. Curious eyes watched from the darkness. Ava reached the entryway and opened the door. Before she could speak, a white sergeant standing at the front stepped forward holding paperwork in his hand. His expression was confident, certain, like a man who believed tonight's outcome had already been decided. "Ava Brooks?" he asked. "Yes," she replied calmly. "We have a warrant to search this property." The words hung in the air. Behind him, officers began moving toward the house. Ava studied the document briefly. Her eyes moved across the page. Her legal instincts immediately noticed something that didn't feel right. The address was correct. The signatures appeared valid. Yet something about the circumstances felt strangely rushed. "May I know what this concerns?" she asked. The sergeant offered a tight smile. "You'll have plenty of time for questions later." Several officers entered. Others began documenting the property. Drawers were opened. Cabinets checked. Computers noted. Everything appeared procedural, but the atmosphere felt unusually aggressive for what should have been a routine warrant execution. Ava remained composed. She watched quietly as strangers moved through her home. Family photographs sat on shelves. Degrees hung framed on the walls. Awards occupied a bookshelf in her study. Yet none of the officers seemed interested in understanding whose house they had entered. They had arrived believing a story, and they were determined to follow it. What none of them realized was that the woman standing silently in the hallway was carrying a secret capable of changing every assumption in that house before sunrise. Ava Brooks stood near the hallway entrance with her hands loosely folded in front of her, while officers moved from room to room. She did not argue. She did not demand special treatment. Instead, she watched. Years inside courtrooms had taught her something most people never learned. The first person who lost control often lost perspective. The house carried a strange mixture of sounds. Cabinet doors opening, quiet radio chatter, footsteps crossing hardwood floors, the occasional scratch of a pen against paper. Outside, dawn was still hours away. The neighborhood remained wrapped in darkness, but curiosity was spreading. More lights appeared in neighboring homes. Shadows moved behind curtains. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath. Sergeant Daniel Mercer walked through the living room with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He studied shelves, glanced at framed certificates, and occasionally exchanged brief instructions with his team. Yet there was something unusual about his behavior. He was not searching for answers. He appeared to be searching for confirmation. Ava noticed it immediately. Every question he asked seemed designed to support a conclusion he had already reached. Every glance suggested certainty rather than investigation. That bothered her more than the warrant itself. In the dining room, one officer paused near a wall covered with framed photographs. Family gatherings, graduation ceremonies, community events. Years of memories preserved behind glass. The officer examined them briefly before moving on. A few moments later, he stopped again. His eyes settled on a photograph showing Ava standing beside several federal officials during a public ceremony in Washington, D.C. He looked at it for a second longer than expected. Then he continued walking. Mercer entered Ava's home office. The room was neat and organized. Law books lined the shelves. Case binders sat in carefully labeled rows. A brass desk lamp cast a warm pool of light across an otherwise dark room. On the desk rested several folders stacked with meticulous precision. Mercer glanced around slowly. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for Ava to notice. This was not the office of someone living a double life. It looked exactly like the workspace of a disciplined legal professional. Still, Mercer continued. He opened drawers, examined notebooks, checked filing cabinets. His confidence remained intact, but small cracks were beginning to appear around the edges. Ava remained silent. Her calmness seemed to frustrate him. Most people reacted with fear when police entered their homes unexpectedly. Others became angry. Some demanded explanations. Ava did none of those things. She simply observed. At one point, Mercer stepped back into the hallway and studied her face. "You seem unusually calm," he said. Ava met his gaze. "People tend to think more clearly when they stay calm." Mercer gave a brief smile that never reached his eyes. "Not everyone has that luxury." Ava said nothing. The silence lingered between them. Then Mercer walked away. Minutes passed. The search continued. Somewhere in the house, an officer opened a storage cabinet. Another reviewed documents collected from a desk. The atmosphere remained tense but controlled. Then a young officer emerged from the office carrying a thick binder. He looked uncertain, confused, like someone who had just discovered something he did not fully understand. He approached Mercer quietly and handed him the binder. Mercer accepted it without concern. First, then he opened the cover. The confidence vanished from his face for the first time that night. His eyes moved across the page. Once, then again. The room suddenly felt colder. And for the first time since arriving at the house, Sergeant Daniel Mercer stopped speaking. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant crackle of a police radio outside. Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood motionless in the middle of Ava Brooks's office, the binder still open in his hands. His eyes remained fixed on the first page. The young officer who had found it shifted uneasily beside him. "Sergeant?" he asked quietly. Mercer did not answer immediately. Ava watched from the hallway. Her expression remained calm, but inside she was beginning to understand exactly what had happened. The binder should never have surprised anyone. It sat openly on her desk. It was properly labeled. It was secured according to protocol. Yet no one had expected to find it there because no one had expected her. Mercer slowly closed the binder. He looked toward Ava. For the first time that night, uncertainty appeared behind his eyes. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Ava tilted her head slightly. "You found it in my office." Mercer tightened his jaw. "That is not what I meant." Ava said nothing. Silence settled over the room again. Several officers had stopped what they were doing. One stood near the staircase holding a clipboard. Another remained beside the dining room table. They were all watching now. Something had shifted. The confidence that had filled the house when they arrived was fading. In its place came doubt. Mercer opened the binder again. This time he turned several pages. His face became harder to read with each document. Names, reports, internal reviews, financial records, investigative notes. None of it looked ordinary. None of it looked like evidence connected to the search warrant. It looked official. Extremely official. One officer stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Mercer ignored the question. He turned another page. Then another. The room seemed to grow smaller around him. Ava could almost see the calculations happening inside his head. He was trying to reconcile two different realities. The woman standing before him did not match the story that had brought his team to the house. The house itself did not match the story. The office did not match the story. And now the binder definitely did not match the story. Finally Mercer looked up. "What exactly do you do for a living, Ms. Brooks?" The question hung in the air. Ava glanced briefly toward the photographs on the wall. Images from courtrooms, conferences, community programs, public service events. All visible. All ignored until now. "You never asked," she replied calmly. Mercer stared at her. Before he could respond, another officer entered the office carrying a laptop that had been cataloged from the study. "Sergeant, you should probably see this." Mercer looked irritated. "What now?" The officer turned the screen toward him. A secure government login portal filled the display. Several credentials were visible beneath the lock screen. Mercer read them once, then again. The color drained from his face. The officer holding the laptop suddenly looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Around the house, conversations stopped completely. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for another document. Nobody opened another drawer. Ava remained exactly where she was. Calm, patient, watching. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to appear beyond the neighborhood rooftops. Pale blue light touched the edges of the windows. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever, because for the first time that night, the officers were no longer searching for evidence. They were searching for an explanation. The explanation arrived sooner than anyone expected. A phone began ringing somewhere inside the house. Not a personal phone. Not a patrol phone. A secure government line coming from the laptop that still sat open on the desk. Every officer in the room turned toward the sound. The screen flashed with an incoming call request marked with federal credentials. The young officer holding the laptop looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the screen. Neither moved. Ava finally stepped forward for the first time since the search began. Her movements were calm and measured. She did not rush. She did not smile. She simply extended her hand. "That call is for me," she said. Nobody objected. The young officer handed her the laptop almost automatically. Ava accepted the device and answered. "Brooks speaking." The room remained silent. The voice on the other end was impossible for the officers to hear, but the change in Ava's expression told them enough. She listened carefully. Occasionally she nodded. Once she glanced toward Mercer. Then she spoke again. "Yes, sir. They are all here." Another pause. "Understood." When the call ended, Ava closed the laptop and placed it gently on the desk. Nobody asked what had been said. Nobody seemed eager to know the answer. Mercer finally broke the silence. "Who was that?" Ava looked directly at him. "The Deputy Assistant Attorney General." The words landed like a weight in the center of the room. Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. One lowered his eyes immediately. Another shifted his footing. Mercer remained still, but the confidence that had accompanied him through the front door hours earlier was almost completely gone. Ava continued. "He was calling because I failed to attend a scheduled briefing 30 minutes ago. No one spoke. A briefing regarding an ongoing federal investigation." Mercer swallowed. The sound was almost audible in the silence. Ava walked toward a bookshelf and removed a framed credential. She handed it to him. Mercer stared at the identification card behind the glass. Federal Department of Justice. United States Attorney's Office. Special Investigations Division. Her photograph, her name, her title. Every detail was unmistakable. The reality everyone had been resisting finally became impossible to ignore. Ava Brooks was not the subject of an investigation. She was the investigator. The room seemed smaller than before, heavy, uncomfortable. Mercer handed the credential back without saying a word. Ava returned it to the shelf. Dawn continued spreading beyond the windows. The blue darkness outside was slowly giving way to pale morning light. Across the street, neighbors still watched from their homes, unaware that the entire situation had quietly turned upside down. Then another officer stepped into the office carrying a folder he had discovered in a locked cabinet. He looked uncertain. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I think you need to see this too." Mercer accepted the folder. He opened it. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the third. His face lost what little color remained. The officer beside him frowned. "What is it?" Mercer did not answer. He simply turned the folder around. Several names filled the page under the heading Internal Corruption Review. Near the top sat the name Daniel Mercer. Directly beneath it were dates, reports, financial records, and interview summaries. Mercer stared at the page as though it belonged to someone else. Ava said nothing. She did not need to. The truth had finally entered the room on its own. Daniel Mercer continued staring at the folder long after everyone else had finished reading the expression on his face. The house had become unnaturally quiet. Even the officers standing near the front entrance seemed unsure where to look. A few hours earlier they had entered with certainty. Now uncertainty sat in every corner of the room. Mercer slowly lowered the folder onto the desk. His eyes moved toward Ava Brooks. For the first time that morning, he looked less like a commanding officer and more like a man trying to understand how the ground beneath him had shifted so completely. Ava remained calm. She stood beside the bookshelf with her hands loosely folded. Her posture relaxed despite everything that had happened. She did not appear angry. She did not appear triumphant. If anything, she looked disappointed. That expression unsettled Mercer more than any accusation could have. He finally cleared his throat. "You were investigating us." Ava met his gaze. "I was investigating evidence." The answer landed heavily. One officer near the staircase lowered his eyes. Another quietly stepped away from the office doorway. No one wanted attention. No one wanted to become part of the conversation. Mercer glanced back at the documents. The pages contained months of information. Financial records, interview notes, internal reports, carefully documented timelines. The investigation was real, thorough, professional. Most disturbing of all, it had clearly been underway long before anyone arrived at this house. "Why was my name there?" Mercer asked. Ava remained silent for a moment before answering. "Because it appeared repeatedly in witness statements." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the windows. The flashing patrol lights that had dominated the neighborhood all night suddenly looked less powerful beneath the growing daylight. Mercer walked slowly toward the living room. He looked around the house with different eyes now. The framed degrees, the legal awards, the photographs with federal officials, the shelves lined with law books. All of it had been visible from the beginning. None of it had been hidden. Yet somehow none of it had mattered when assumptions took control. That realization seemed to weigh heavily on him. Near the dining room table, a veteran officer quietly removed his notebook and closed it. Another officer began organizing documents that had been left open during the search. Their movements had changed. Earlier they searched with confidence. Now they handled everything carefully, almost respectfully. The atmosphere felt entirely different. Then a new phone call broke the silence. This time it came directly to Mercer. He looked down at the screen. His expression tightened immediately. The caller was Captain Richard Hale. Every officer recognized the name. Mercer answered at once. "Captain." Nobody could hear the voice on the other end, but they could see Mercer's reaction. He listened. His shoulders stiffened. Then he listened longer. The color slowly drained from his face. Finally, he replied with only 3 words. "Yes, sir. Understood." The call ended. Mercer lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen for several seconds. The room waited. No one needed to ask what had happened. They already knew it would not be good. Mercer looked toward Ava. The silence stretched. Then he spoke quietly. "The captain is on his way here." Ava nodded once. She seemed unsurprised. Mercer looked around the room again. The officers who had followed him into the house now avoided eye contact entirely. Dawn had arrived. The night was over. But for Daniel Mercer, something far more difficult was only beginning. The wait for Captain Richard Hale felt longer than it actually was. Nobody returned to searching the house. Nobody touched another document. The energy that had filled every room before dawn had disappeared, leaving behind a strange stillness. Sunlight now stretched across the hardwood floors in long golden bands. Dust drifted through the beams of light. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower started in the distance. Ordinary sounds had returned to the neighborhood. But inside Ava Brooks's home, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Ava moved quietly into the kitchen and filled a kettle with water. The simple act seemed to confuse several officers. They watched her without speaking. She placed the kettle on the stove and waited. Calm, patient, entirely in control of herself. Mercer remained near the dining room table. His phone sat silent in his hand. The folder containing the corruption review rested beside him. He had not opened it again. He did not need to. He already knew enough. More importantly, he now understood that Ava had known enough for a very long time. The realization lingered heavily in his mind. For months, perhaps longer, she had gathered facts while others relied on assumptions. One officer finally broke the silence. "How long?" he asked quietly. Ava looked up. "How long what? How long has the investigation been active?" Ava considered the question. 18 months. Several officers exchanged glances. 18 months. The number carried weight. That was not a rushed inquiry. That was not a personal dispute. That was a serious federal investigation built piece by piece over time. Mercer stared at the floor. The answer seemed to affect him more than anyone else. A kettle began to whistle softly. Ava poured hot water into a mug and added a tea bag. The aroma of chamomile drifted through the kitchen. It was such a normal moment that it almost felt surreal. Hours earlier, police vehicles had lined the street. Officers had entered convinced they were uncovering something dangerous. Now they stood quietly while the homeowner prepared tea. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A vehicle finally pulled into the driveway. Every officer recognized it immediately. Captain Richard Hale had arrived. Through the front window, they watched him step out of his car. He did not rush. He did not appear angry. Yet the expression on his face caused several officers to straighten instinctively. Hale entered the house moments later. His eyes moved across the room. The officers, the documents, the open laptop, the evidence folders. Then finally Ava. He removed his hat. "Ms. Brooks." Ava nodded politely. "Captain." Hale glanced toward Mercer. The look lasted only a second, but it said enough. Years of leadership had taught him how to assess a situation quickly. He understood the seriousness almost immediately. No one spoke while he reviewed several documents. The silence grew heavier with every page. Eventually Hale closed the folder and exhaled slowly. He looked around the room before speaking. "There will be a full review of everything that happened here this morning." His voice was calm but firm. Nobody questioned him. Nobody interrupted. Hale then turned toward Ava. "I believe you were scheduled to attend a federal briefing today." Ava nodded. "I was." Hale looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I am sorry that you missed it because of this." The apology hung in the air. Quiet, simple, genuine. And somehow those few words carried more weight than anything else that had happened since 3 o'clock that morning. Captain Hale's apology remained in the air long after he finished speaking. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody attempted to explain away what had happened. The morning sunlight continued creeping across the floor, illuminating details that had gone unnoticed during the darkness. A family photograph rested beside a bookshelf. A framed law school diploma hung near the staircase. A small American flag stood on a shelf beside several public service awards. The house looked exactly the same as it had before dawn. The difference was that people were finally seeing it. Hale slowly walked through the living room. He examined the credentials displayed on the wall. Community leadership awards, legal achievement recognitions, federal commendations, the kind of accomplishments that took years of dedication to earn. He stopped near a framed photograph showing Ava standing beside senior Department of Justice officials. "How many people know you are leading the investigation?" Hale asked quietly. Ava set her tea mug down. "Very few." Hale nodded. That answer explained a great deal. Sensitive investigations often required discretion. Identities remained protected. Information remained compartmentalized. The fewer people who knew, the harder it became to compromise the work. Mercer stood silently near the dining room table. He looked exhausted now. Not physically, mentally. The events of the morning seemed to be replaying behind his eyes. Every assumption, every decision, every conclusion reached before facts had been verified. For years he had trusted his instincts. Tonight those instincts had led him directly into the home of the person overseeing one of the most important investigations of his career. Hale eventually turned toward him. "When did you receive the warrant request?" Mercer answered immediately. "Yesterday afternoon." "Who initiated it?" Mercer hesitated. That hesitation drew everyone's attention. Hale noticed it instantly. "Sergeant." Mercer glanced toward the folder, then toward Ava. Finally, he looked at Hale. The request originated from an anonymous source. The room became quiet again. Hale's expression hardened. Anonymous sources existed. They sometimes proved useful, but they were rarely sufficient on their own. Not for something this significant. "And what independent verification was completed?" Hale asked. Mercer did not answer immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Hale closed his eyes briefly. The realization seemed to settle heavily upon him. Ava watched the exchange without satisfaction. She had spent her career understanding what happened when people abandoned procedure. Rules existed for a reason. Facts mattered for a reason. Assumptions carried consequences. The consequences now stood in plain sight around the room. One of the younger officers shifted nervously. "Captain, are you saying someone sent us here intentionally?" Hale looked toward him. "I am saying we do not know yet." Ava finally spoke. Her voice remained calm. But someone benefited from sending attention in the wrong direction. Every officer understood what she meant. If an active federal investigation suddenly became distracted, delayed, or compromised, certain people might gain valuable time. The possibility hung heavily in the room. Hale slowly nodded. "Which means this morning may have been more than a mistake." Nobody spoke after that. Outside, the neighborhood had fully awakened. Cars moved down the street. Children waited for school buses. Normal life continued. Inside the house, however, a far more troubling realization had emerged. The officers had arrived believing they were uncovering the truth. Instead, they may have stumbled directly into a larger scheme designed to keep the truth hidden. For a long moment, nobody spoke after Ava's observation. The possibility that someone had deliberately redirected law enforcement attention away from the real targets of the investigation changed everything. Captain Hale understood it immediately. What had looked like an embarrassing mistake now carried the scent of manipulation. He walked slowly toward the dining room window and looked out at the quiet neighborhood. Children climbed onto a school bus at the corner. A mail truck rolled down the street. The ordinary world continued moving while an entirely different reality unfolded inside the house. Hale turned back toward the room. "We need to know who submitted the original information," he said. Mercer nodded. This time there was no argument in him. No defensiveness. Only concern. One of the officers retrieved a tablet containing the warrant request records. Within minutes they were reviewing timestamps, routing logs, and authorization notes. Ava remained near the kitchen counter, listening quietly. She had spent years watching investigations evolve. Sometimes the most important breakthrough arrived only after people stopped defending their assumptions and started following facts. The officer reviewing the records suddenly frowned. "Captain, there is something strange here." Every head turned toward him. He enlarged several entries on the screen. The anonymous submission came through a secure relay network. That part is unusual by itself. But look at the timing. Hale stepped closer. Mercer followed. The officer pointed to the screen. The tip had arrived less than 24 hours after a sealed federal filing connected to the corruption investigation had been submitted. The room became silent again. Ava slowly set down her tea mug. She did not need anyone to explain the significance. The timing was too precise to ignore. Someone had known enough about the investigation to react almost immediately. Hale looked toward Ava. How many people had access to that filing? "Very few," she answered. "Most of them federal." Mercer rubbed his forehead. The realization was unsettling. If someone had reacted that quickly, then the investigation might have attracted attention from individuals far more connected than anyone originally suspected. The young officer continued examining the records. Then his eyes widened. "Captain." Hale looked up. "What is it?" The officer swallowed. The relay network was not local. He turned the screen toward them. It originated nearly 600 miles away. Hale stared at the information. Mercer did the same. Whoever submitted the tip had taken extraordinary steps to hide their identity. That was not the behavior of a concerned citizen. That was the behavior of someone protecting something. Or someone. Ava finally spoke. "Which means the search was never really about me." Nobody disagreed. Hale nodded slowly. "It was about creating a distraction." The words settled heavily over the room. Mercer looked around the house once more. He noticed details he had ignored before. The legal texts, the framed awards, the evidence of a life built on discipline and service. Then he looked at Ava. "You knew this was possible, did not you?" Ava considered the question carefully. "I knew that investigations make people uncomfortable," she replied. "I did not expect this." Her honesty somehow carried more weight than certainty would have. Hale closed the tablet and handed it back to the officer. His expression had changed. The morning was no longer about a failed search. It was about a much larger question. Who was afraid enough of the truth to set all of this in motion? The question lingered long after nobody answered it. Who was afraid enough of the truth to risk exposing an entire operation just to slow an investigation? The morning sun now filled Ava Brooks's home with warm light. The flashing patrol lights outside had disappeared. Most of the officers had quietly left. Only a handful remained with Captain Hale, reviewing records and documenting everything that had happened. The atmosphere no longer felt tense. It felt reflective, like the final moments after a storm had passed. Ava stood near the front window looking out at the neighborhood. Children had gone to school. Parents had left for work. Life had resumed its normal rhythm. Yet she knew this day would not be forgotten anytime soon. Behind her, Mercer carefully gathered several documents that had been removed during the search. His movements were slower now, more deliberate. He placed each item exactly where it belonged. Eventually he approached Ava. For a moment neither spoke. Then Mercer cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Ava turned toward him. His voice carried none of the confidence that had filled it hours earlier. There was no authority in it, no defensiveness, only honesty. "I came here convinced I already knew who you were," he said. "I never stopped to question it." Ava listened quietly. Mercer glanced toward the floor before continuing. "The truth was right in front of me the entire time. I just never saw it." The admission hung in the air. Ava considered his words carefully. Then she nodded once. "That happens more often than people realize." Mercer looked surprised by the absence of anger in her response. Perhaps he had expected condemnation. Instead he found understanding. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Simply understanding. Captain Hale approached a moment later carrying a folder. The review process begins today, he said. Everything will be documented. Every decision. Every step. Ava nodded. That is all I ask. Hale studied her for a second. You are not interested in revenge. Ava looked toward the photographs on her wall. Images of family, mentors, colleagues, years of work dedicated to a single principle. Justice and revenge are not the same thing, she said quietly. The room fell silent once more. Hale lowered his eyes briefly. Mercer did the same. They both understood the difference. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the street. Sunlight reflected softly against the glass of the front window. The house finally felt peaceful again. One by one, the remaining officers gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. No dramatic speeches followed. No grand declarations. Just people carrying the weight of lessons learned. Before stepping outside, Mercer paused at the front door. He looked back once. Ava remained standing in the living room, calm as ever. The same woman he had met hours earlier. The difference was that now he actually saw her. Not as a suspect. Not as a name on a warrant. Not as an assumption. As a person. As a professional. As someone who had remained dignified even when others failed to do the same. Mercer gave a small nod. Ava returned it. Then he stepped outside into the sunlight. The door closed gently behind him. Inside the quiet house, Ava walked to a shelf and straightened a family photograph. The frame caught the morning light for a brief moment before settling back into place. And in that silence, without anger, without celebration, and without a single word more, the truth finally stood exactly where it belonged.